from a recent ally. The former Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon said her proposed Brexit deal is doomed and he will vote against it in the Commons on the 11th of December. His criticism comes after a warning from President Trump last night that her Brexit agreement could threaten a future US-UK trade deal. The Prime Minister is in Wales this morning and visits Northern Ireland later as she tries to sell what she sees as the benefits of the deal. Strong, isn't it? He thinks she's wasting her time.
Joanna, you get the sense that at her morning meetings, Mrs May probably turns around to her advisers and says, have any of you got any good news? Because it just seems to be a pretty steady diet of setbacks. Obviously, we had President Trump overnight suggesting that there was no question of a trade deal. Now we have Sir Michael Fallon laying into the agreement in very uncompromising language. And why it's interesting that he is now turning on the deal is because he's not been really associated with any of the rival Brexit camps. He's previously been staunchly loyal really to the party and Mrs May. So when he speaks out in this sort of way, it's a sort of weather vane, I guess. And that adds to the impact of what he said. And what he said was it's a bad deal and Mrs May needs to get a better deal. He also seemed to reopen a doubt about whether Mrs May can survive all this, because he was asked, is Mrs May doomed? To which he answered, well, that's up to my colleagues, which of course is not exactly a ringing endorsement. But have a listen to what he said about Mrs May's agreement.
My fear is this deal actually just gives us the worst of all worlds. No guarantee of smooth trade in the future and no ability to reduce the tariffs that we need to conclude trade deals with the rest of the world. So unless the Commons, I think, can be persuaded somehow that those things are possible, yes, then I think the deal is doomed.
So what are we to make of all this? Well, I'm joined by the Conservative Brexiteer, Sir Bernard Jenkin. I mean, let's start with Michael Fallon's comments. Significant?
Highly significant. He was not one of the names on our list of likely rebels, and I think that just demonstrates how the authority of what the Prime Minister has negotiated is collapsing.
Do you sense that on the backbenches she is losing rather than gaining support?
Well, we'll wait and see. I mean, the traditional thing is the number of suspects who are going to rebel against the government tends to crumble towards the actual vote. The Prime Minister's obviously chosen to play it long and to appeal over the heads of her party and her members of Parliament to the country at large. She's got a lot of personal sympathy for the problems she faces, but the polls are quite clear. They don't like this deal. While people feel sympathy for her, it doesn't necessarily reflect in what they think should happen next.
Sir Michael Fallon was asked the question, if the deal is doomed, is she doomed? Let me put that question to you.
Well, I thought his answer that that's a matter for my colleagues was rather prophetic. Let's see what happens in the vote. If it's very close and she's able to go back to Brussels and tweak the deal to deal with, for example, the backstop, and then bring it back to the House of Commons, she may yet survive. If it's a massive and crushing defeat, well, that's the other end of the spectrum. If it's somewhere in between, we'll have to wait and see. But the big problem is, if she gets this deal through, the DUP have said they're going to review the coalition agreement. So a lot of colleagues are thinking, I better not vote for this deal because it could mean the end of the coalition. And she's not explaining in any fashion what would happen if she gets the deal through.
Let's just talk about Donald Trump too. I mean, he's wrong actually, because the political declaration states explicitly that the UK government will be able to develop its own independent trade policy.
Well, it all depends what you mean by an independent trade policy. We've got a Department for International Trade and it's promoting British trade, but it's not able to do a 360-degree comprehensive free trade agreement because you need control over your domestic regulation and product standards in order to be able to dismantle what the other party regards as the non-tariff barriers in your product standards, and you need to be able to adjust your tariff rates because you trade off your tariff rates as part of the deal. Neither of those things are available now, and under the withdrawal agreement, neither of those things will be available. You know, some people argue in the backstop the UK could have that, but of course that would mean a regulatory border down the Irish Sea, which no Prime Minister could support, so that's not going to happen. So we're stuck in a deal where we could be stuck in the customs union, stuck with EU products and standards, and therefore unable to do a proper free trade deal with the United States, which is what they want.
And briefly, the idea of a TV debate between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, this is Downing Street trying to polarise the debate between Labour and Conservative, and it's very easy for the media and the BBC to just see the debate as that. Here's one in favour of the deal, one against the deal, here's one in Labour, one in Conservative. But actually it's rather more complicated than that. You've got two Remain politicians, both supported Remain. Where is the 52% represented in this debate that voted Leave? And I think that broadcasters have got a bit of a dilemma here, because...
Would it be subject to a legal challenge, do you think, if there was that simple head-to-head debate between Mrs May and Jeremy Corbyn?
I'm not an expert on legal challenges, but I think the majority of people, this is not like people are being informed in advance of their voting, like a general election or a referendum. I think people will be rather turned off by the debate, and they will say, well, why are they bothering to have to debate? Why don't they just get on with it and decide it themselves? Because that's what we're paid to do.
Okay, Bernard Jenkins, thanks very much. Joe, I should tell you that's more not so good news for Mrs May this morning from Arlene Foster, who's been doing an interview over in Belfast, and she again reiterated that there was no way the DUP was going to support the party. More than that, some of the language was pretty strong, accusing Mrs May of giving up on trying to get a better deal and, quotes, wasting her time in trying to sell this deal. So more tough words for Mrs May.
Norman, thank you. Well, the Prime Minister has been visiting Wales this morning, and she's off to Northern Ireland this afternoon to meet with political leaders and the public in an attempt to sell her Brexit deal. Let's get the latest from Chris Page, our Ireland correspondent, joining us from Belfast. Well, the politics and politicians of Northern Ireland playing a very significant part in all of this. Chris.
Yes, they certainly are, so no surprise that Theresa May is coming to Belfast very early on, really, in her effort to sell the deal. She'll come here to Queen's University in South Belfast. It is a little bit damp, as you can see, but I think that the rain will be the least of her worries as she tries to weather this particular political storm. Here, though, I think she's likely to receive a pretty warm reception. She's going to meet students, she's going to meet academics, she's going to meet church and community leaders too. Later on, she'll be going to Stormont to meet with the 5 main political parties, and one person who's not on her side, as we've been hearing from Norman there, in the Brexit story, is the Democratic Unionist Party, who are still officially the government's parliamentary allies. It's their 10 MPs that keep the minority government in power, but that relationship has been strained in recent days since the draft agreement was published. The DUP totally opposed to it on the grounds that they believe it'll tie Northern Ireland too closely under the terms of the backstop, which would prevent checks on the Irish border if there's no free trade deal. They believe that backstop would leave Northern Ireland too closely tied to the EU and not closely enough tied with the rest of the UK. And the leader of the Democratic Unionists, Arlene Foster, has been speaking to us this morning. Let's hear what she had to say.
Well, I think the disappointing thing for me is that the Prime Minister has given up, and she's saying this is where we are and we just have to accept that. But she may have given up on further negotiations and trying to find a better deal, but I haven't given up. I believe in a better way forward, and I believe we must find that.
She would say she's done anything but given up. What she's trying to do is actually get something done that is realistic, rather than spend another 2 years talking about what might be.
Well, if you listen to some of her closest aides, they know that the backstop is a bad thing. Even Philip Hammond at the weekend said he didn't like the backstop. It was bad for Northern Ireland and bad for the economy. And they were going to find different ways of making sure that the backstop wouldn't be invoked. Well, if that's the case, why is it in there in the first place? Why do we need to have the backstop in the withdrawal agreement? It's time to get rid of it and to try to find a better deal.
The DUP leader Arlene Foster talking to our political editor Laura Koonsberg there. Again, making it very clear that the Democratic Unionists intend to vote against this draft agreement whenever it does go before the House of Commons in that meaningful vote scheduled for 2 weeks today. That was a message that Mrs Foster brought to her party conference, which was held at the weekend. It was also addressed by the leading Brexiteer Boris Johnson, who got a pretty enthusiastic reception there. Also there were many business leaders who actually are on the other side of the argument on this to the DUP. Last week Theresa May had a reception in Downing Street in which leading business figures from the likes of the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Institute of Directors were there, and they publicly come out in support of the deal. They say, as far as they are looking at the situation, it's a choice between this deal or a no deal, and a no deal will be disastrous for Northern Ireland businesses. So businesses have been very public in their support for Mrs May on this, though that hasn't swayed Northern Ireland's main political party, the Democratic Unionists.
Thank you very much, Chris. A bus company has been fined £2.3 million for significant health and safety failings after a fatigued driver ploughed into a supermarket in 2015, killing a passenger and a pedestrian. The court was told the company, Midland Red South, behaved irresponsibly by ignoring signs that the driver was unsafe and tired. Phil Medicott, the managing director of the bus company, made a statement outside Birmingham Crown Court.
None of us at our company will ever forget the terrible events of October the 3rd, 2015. We are deeply sorry for the heartache of everyone affected, particularly the families of Rowan Fitzgerald and Dora Hancock. Safety is and always will be our first concern, and we take our responsibilities extremely seriously. We've made it our continuing priority to work very closely with the authorities to help fully understand and learn detailed lessons from what has happened. We know and fully accept there were a number of failings at our company, and we bear the weight of our responsibility for this terrible tragedy. That is why we made it.
Russia's president is warning Ukraine against any reckless acts after Kiev declared martial law. It comes after Russian forces on Sunday captured 3 of Kiev's ships off the coast of Crimea. We can see a picture of the apparent damage to one of the boats that's been shared by the Ukrainian military on Twitter. According to a statement from the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin had a phone conversation with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in which he said he hoped Berlin could intervene with Ukrainian authorities to dissuade them from further reckless acts. The ride-sharing service Uber has been fined £385,000 by UK regulators for failing to protect customers' personal information during a cyber attack. The Information Commissioner's Office said a series of what it called avoidable data security flaws allowed the personal details of around 2.7 million UK customers to be accessed and downloaded by attackers from a cloud-based storage system. You're watching BBC News. An update on our headlines on BBC News. Theresa May is on the road trying to rally support for her Brexit deal as her former Defence Secretary Michael Fallon launches a scathing attack saying the deal is doomed. The bus company Midland Red South has been fined £2.3 million for ignoring warnings about a driver who killed 2 people in a crash in 2015. And 18 migrants have been rescued from 2 small boats in the English Channel. It's believed one was carrying an 18-month-old child. Let's join Hugh for a sports update.
Hello, good afternoon to you, Joanna. After being made one of the scapegoats by some for England's embarrassing early exit at the 2015 Rugby World Cup, Sam Burgess has hit back, blaming individual egos and selfish players. Burgess switched codes back to Rugby League following the tournament when England became the first host nation to fail to get out of the group stage. And after receiving more criticism today for his perceived part in that, he has responded on Twitter saying, "If people actually re-watch the games I participated in, you will see I added to the team. What cost us an early exit was individual egos and selfish players not following our leader, which essentially cost the coach and other great men their jobs. Tournaments are not won by the coaching staff or by one player. It takes a commitment from the full group. I guarantee you this, I was committed, but others had their own agendas." Both Manchester clubs can make it through to the last 16 of the Champions League tonight. City are away to Lyon. United take on Young Boys of Switzerland. It's been suggested that the Manchester United team feels more pressure playing at Old Trafford, where they haven't yet won in Europe so far this season. But manager Jose Mourinho has no time for that.
If you feel pressure, stay at home. But when I say home, I don't say stadium home. I say home, and watch on TV. If you feel pressure to play matches at home where the people come to support, come on. I never felt pressure to play at home.
England women's cricket captain Heather Knight says it would be great for the sport if a T20 competition was included in the Commonwealth Games. The ICC has put in a bid for it to be played at the 2022 Games in Birmingham.
I think it's a brilliant idea. I think, having seen the women's netball team, the sort of reach they got when they won that gold medal, I think it's a logical step for the sport. I think it'll be brilliant. It'll get more girls playing the game globally, I think, and yeah, I think it'd be quite special to be able to play in the Commonwealth Games.
And that's all your sport for now. Much more coming up in the next hour.
Thank you very much. See you then. An 18-month-old child is among 18 people who've been rescued from 2 boats in the English Channel. A lifeboat was called at 4:30 after a 3-metre-long boat was spotted by a fishing boat off Dover. A Border Force boat picked up 9 suspected migrants and brought them to shore, where they were handed over to immigration officials. A second migrant boat carrying 9 people was intercepted off Dunkirk. The Coast Guard is advising ships in the Channel to look out for small boats. Our correspondent Simon Jones is in Dover and has the latest on the attempted Channel crossings.
Well, despite warnings that migrants are risking their lives attempting to get to the UK via the busiest shipping lane in the world, still the attempts are continuing. 2 more in the early hours of this morning. We had 1 boat spotted around 6 miles off Dover. There were 9 people on board that boat, including a very young child. Now, we've seen the boat after it was brought back into Dover. It is very, very small. And if you think the people on that boat were in the cold, they're in the dark, there were ferries around, other boats, and it was actually this small boat spotted by a ferry who alerted the emergency services. In addition to this, around the same time in French waters, another boat was spotted, this time a fishing boat, and also on that 9 migrants. Now, a big emergency operation was launched and the 9 migrants were found, and those migrants were transported back to the French side of the Channel. They have been taken back by a boat to Dunkirk. But over the past month or so, we know that more than 100 migrants have successfully managed to reach the UK in small boats, and these are only the ones we know about, because often we're relying on people to tip us off when they see something suspicious. The Home Office here are not proactively telling us about these attempts, but what we do know is there has been a big spike in recent weeks, and that has continued this morning.
And why is it? What are the theories behind why suddenly these boats are coming?
I think there's 2 main theories. One is, although it's rather cold, the weather is quite benign, particularly for November, so it may be people taking advantage of good conditions to try to get across the Channel. Another theory is it's to do with, well, mention that word again, Brexit, because the theory is that there's a people smuggling gang operating over in northern France, and they are potentially whipping the migrants up into a bit of a state of frenzy, saying once Brexit happens, the borders could be far tougher. And so they're saying to the migrants, if you want to try to get across the Channel, you need to do it now while the weather isn't too bad, and you need to do it before Brexit. Now, most of those who arrived so far have claimed to be from Iran, and that's partly because at the moment Britain does not forcefully return migrants to Iran, and also the theory is that some people are flying from Iran into Serbia, where they're allowed visa-free travel, then continuing to northern France and ultimately trying to get to this side of the Channel.
So what happens to them once they're here and they've been picked up?
Well, they're handed over to the immigration authorities, and they will assess in the coming days whether the people have a right to stay here. Many of them will no doubt lodge asylum claims here. The people who arrive who are unaccompanied are handed over to the local authorities to be looked after, but we have heard in recent weeks some of those handed over to the local authority have simply disappeared into the system, which is very worrying when you consider potentially how young and vulnerable they are. But many people here would say they don't have a great deal of sympathy, and the French should be doing more to stop the boats launching in the first place. And that's certainly the view of the Dover MP Charlie Elphick, who says the Border Force here are not doing enough. They need to get a grip of this situation. The French need to get a grip of it too. The Border Force say they have stepped up patrols in recent weeks because of the number of migrants attempting to get across by boat, but For some, they're managing to get through, so these extra patrols are not totally working.
Simon Jones reporting. The British academic Matthew Hedges has arrived back in the UK after he received a pardon following his conviction for spying in the United Arab Emirates. He's always denied the charge and said he was carrying out research for his PhD. He's released a statement thanking the Foreign Office and paying tribute to his wife Daniela. In the statement he says, "I don't know where to begin with thanking people for securing my release. I could not have done this without Daniela. I hear her faces everywhere. She is so brave and strong. I thank you all once again. This is very surreal." Our correspondent Paul Adams reports.
Less than a week ago, Matthew Hedges was facing life in prison. Now he's a free man, able to resume his personal and professional life. The authorities in the UAE continue to believe he was a spy.
He was part-time PhD researcher, part-time businessman, but he was 100% a full-time Secret Service operative.
It's possible they would have released him months ago if the British government had only admitted as much. But that was never on the cards. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, says there's simply no evidence for the allegation.
We've made it very clear for a number of months now that we see no basis in these allegations. They've reflected on that. They've taken the action that they can, which means that Matthew Hedges is going to be reunited with his family.
My hopes had been shattered on so many occasions that I didn't actually know whether I should brace them up again. So it's just come as a very sudden, very, very happy surprise.
It now seems neither government wanted to risk a serious rupture in relations, something that seemed possible just a few days ago. But lessons will perhaps need to be learned. Universities will have to ask themselves if the Gulf is a safe place for academics to conduct research into sensitive national security subjects, and the Foreign Office will need to examine whether more could have been done earlier on to secure Mr. Hedges' release. Paul Adams, BBC News.
The European Court of Justice in Luxembourg has begun hearing a legal challenge on whether the UK can reverse Article 50 without permission from the other EU member states. Remain campaigners are hoping the case will give Britain the option to stay in the EU in the event of another referendum. Our Brussels reporter Adam Fleming says there are a few reasons why politicians are pushing for the ruling.
The case has been brought by a group of MPs, MSPs and MEPs from the UK, and they want to know whether that letter Theresa May sent triggering the Brexit process could be taken back by the British government without seeking the opinion or the consent or the approval of the other 27 EU member states. The reason they're doing that is because they want to give MPs another option to keep in mind when they vote on the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. I think they also just like the idea of us in the media even talking about the idea of the Brexit process being reversed as an idea, as a theory. Now, this is opposed by the EU. They say that the only unilateral bit about Brexit is the withdrawing country deciding to hand in its letter and notifying the EU that it wants to leave. Once you've handed the letter in, it's kind of a matter for everybody. And what they want to guard against is Article 50 being used as a tactic. In other words, the UK withdraws, then decides it doesn't want to withdraw anymore, then they decide that they do want to leave, and the clock restarts, and that two-year process restarts again under Article 50, and that would be used by a country to extract concessions and a better deal out of the EU. At least that's what the EU fears in theory. As for the British government, they say all of this is academic, completely hypothetical, one for lawyers to boggle over, and just almost as a bit of a hobby for them, because the government has got no intention of cancelling Brexit and no intention of asking for that Article 50 written by Theresa May, asking for it back. In terms of when we'll get a judgment, I don't really know. I mean, the wheels of justice here in Luxembourg do not move very quickly, so it could be a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months before we find out what the judges here think about this particular legal issue.
Experts are warning thousands of cancer patients are dying unnecessarily each year because the health service in England has failed to make the improvements needed. The Health Foundation, which campaigns for better treatment, says more needs to be done to close the gap in survival rates between the UK and other comparable countries. Here's our health correspondent, Nick Triggle.
Over the last 20 years, there have been 4 national cancer strategies. Each has promised the best care for England. But the Health Foundation said while there had been progress, the NHS was still lagging behind. Its analysis shows that only on breast cancer has the health service managed to actually close the gap with the best performing systems. The report warns the lack of progress is costing lives. Each year, 135,000 people die from cancer, but 10,000 of those could be prevented if care was as good as in the other nations. The think tank wants to see better access to tests and scans to speed up diagnosis, but it said services were being undermined by a lack of staff and equipment, which is delaying how quickly patients are seen. The government has already said it aims to tackle this. Last month, the Prime Minister promised the number of cancers being diagnosed early would increase from 1 in 2 to 3 in 4 over the next 10 years, thanks to the extra funding being provided to the health service. The Department of Health and Social Care said more details would be unveiled in the long-term plan for the NHS, which is expected to be published soon. Nick Triggle, BBC News.
Professor Sir Mike Richards, the former head of NHS Cancer Care, explained the problem.
What we know is that our survival has been going up year on year over the last 20 years, but what we haven't been doing is narrowing the gap between ourselves and other comparable countries. It is the role of the GP that's crucial, but it's not just the GP, it's the GP and the next stage on, the diagnostic services in hospitals. Patients, first of all, have got to be willing to go and see their GP when they've got problems. It's a good thing if they don't have to experience waits, and we know all too often at the moment people are having waits to see a GP. GPs are swamped with work, but equally GPs need to be able to refer people on for investigations, and we know that hospitals are swamped. So we have to find a way through this. What we describe this as is having a very tight gatekeeping model, and we need now to find ways of increasing the number of scans that we can do, the number of endoscopies we can do, so that GPs can refer people on for those tests when they need it.
Now time for a look at the weather. We can get the very latest from Chris Fawkes. Hi.
Hi Joanna, thanks a lot. Well, as far as the weather goes today, we've got some rain that's moving into western parts of the country. And that rain's going to be bringing a change to milder conditions, but for most of us we're still actually in the cold air ahead of our band of rain. The milder air will be pushing in just to southern Wales and southwest England later on this afternoon, where temperatures should reach around 10 or 11 degrees, perhaps 12 in places. Still quite cool though ahead of our main band of rain as it continues to edge eastwards. Quite windy as well. Our Irish Sea coast, gusts of around 50, maybe 60 miles an hour. Then tonight, as one band of rain pushes eastwards, it will be followed quite quickly by another dollop of rain coming in from the west. Temperatures, well, much milder compared with recent nights. Lows of 10 degrees towards Plymouth. Still quite chilly air hanging on to the northeast of Scotland for a time, but that will change as we head into Wednesday. Wednesday promises to be another windy day. Gusts could reach around 60 to 70 miles an hour around our coast and hills in the west. So that could cause some localised disruption, bringing some tree branches down. As well as that, there'll be some heavy rain pushing across Northern Ireland into Scotland, and that too could bring one or two problems. So tomorrow could be one of those days where we see some localised transport disruption out and about, and maybe a few power cuts as well. That's your weather.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The Papers, weeknights at 10:40 on the BBC News Channel.
Follow the story, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. You can follow every moment in depth with BBC News. Get the full story at bbc.co.uk/news. Get the headlines as they happen with the Breaking News Alert. And keep up with events by watching the BBC News Channel in the app. Follow the story wherever you are with BBC News.
Hello, you're watching BBC Newsroom Live with Joanna Gosling. Our headlines. Theresa May is on the road trying to rally support for her Brexit deal as her former Defence Secretary Michael Fallon launches a scathing attack, saying the deal is doomed. The bus company Midland Red South has been fined £2.3 million for ignoring warnings about a driver who killed 2 people in a crash in 2015. 18 migrants have been rescued from 2 small boats in the English Channel. It's believed one was carrying an 18-month-old child. Matthew Hedges, the British academic released from detention in the UAE, arrives back in the UK. And NASA's probe on Mars has started sending images back to Earth following its successful landing on the Red Planet. Well, let's get more on Brexit. That warning from the US President Donald Trump that making trade deals with the UK could be difficult under the terms of Theresa May's withdrawal deal. Here is the US President speaking to reporters about the deal.
I think we have to take a look at seriously whether or not the UK is allowed to trade, because, you know, right now, if you look at the deal, they may not be able to trade with us, and that wouldn't be a good thing. I don't think they meant that. I don't think that the Prime Minister meant that, and hopefully she'll be able to do something about that.
Well, with me now is Sir Andrew Khan. He's the former Chief Executive Officer of UK Trade and Investment and a former senior diplomat in Brussels. Welcome. It's not helpful for Theresa May, is it?
It's a pretty extraordinary thing, Joanna. I don't think in my diplomatic career I would have ever have expected the US President to come in with such a deliberately, I assume deliberately unhelpful intervention for the British Prime Minister. It
happened before, though, didn't it, when President Obama came out and said that if we left, Britain would be back of the queue for a trade deal.
Well, he was then asked by the British Prime Minister, as far as we know, to say something like this, and he was saying the truth. Now, in this case, Donald Trump is actually saying something which is true. He actually said we wouldn't be able to trade. That, of course, isn't the case. Trade would go on just as now. What he is right is that we wouldn't, certainly for the period of the transition, the standstill period, be able to finalise a trade deal with the US, or indeed with any other country outside Europe.
And that's just a straightforward fact, isn't it?
It's a fact, and it's
so
always
why
been
does it
known.
matter then that he's saying it?
Well, I guess because he's in effect saying it's a good deal for the EU, by which he implies it's a bad deal for Britain. So he's making that criticism, and he's saying you can't do a trade deal with us, and he's highlighting that. But that's always been the case. If we are to have a standstill, what the government calls an implementation period, and I think almost everybody agrees that that's essential. For the period of that time, we can't do trade deals. That's always been known, and it is a reality, and is a sensible reality. There is another point, of course, which is until countries outside the European Union know what our relationship, our trade relationship with Europe is, they're not going to want to do deals with us. And the deal in front of the House of Commons now doesn't tell us what the long-term relationship will be. The political declaration has lots of warm words, but it doesn't say. And it doesn't say because the British government and the British people don't know what they want. When we have a final deal, trade deal, then countries like America and other countries will negotiate with us. Until that time, they won't. So Donald Trump hasn't said anything new.
I mean, in terms of trade between the US and the UK, how important is it?
It's extremely important. I mean, the US is our biggest and largest trade partner after the EU, and can potentially be much more important. Also, I'd say America is the largest inward investor into this country. So we do need good relations, trade relations with America. We do need to keep their trust and confidence.
Let me tell you, we're just getting comments actually out of Downing Street, the Prime Minister's spokesman responding to President Trump's comments. So let's just have a quick look at what's been said. He said the deal with the EU sets out that we are developing an independent trade policy. Work is underway for an ambitious trade relationship with the US. Working groups have met 5 times so far. The US trade rep has called for the views of the public on future trade agreement. He was asked if the US President is right, that it is a good deal for the EU, and he said the PM has said it's a good deal for the UK. There are no plans for a bilateral conversation with President Trump at the G20 in Argentina this weekend, and there are no plans to get the US ambassador here in Downing Street to explain the deal with the EU, but the spokesman added that we are working with the US very closely.
Well, none of that contradicts what I said.
Yes.
All they're saying is we've had informal contacts with America and we've got working groups going. Of course, I would very much hope they would. I'd expect them to. And that it's very important to have a deal with America once we're able to. Absolutely true. But we are not going to be able to have a deal with America for, well, at least another 2 years of the implementation, and if it goes ahead for actually 3 or 4 years, and it may be extended, that's provided for in the agreement, well, then we can't have a deal with America in that term. We can do all the preparatory work, we can have it ready, oven ready to sign, but we can't sign it until we have left, and we certainly can't implement it until we have left the customs union.
So Andrew Kahn, thank you. Let me just bring you some breaking news about the ticket resale website Viagogo. We're just hearing that there has been a court order for the competition regulator, which will mean that the tickets website will have to give consumers more information, including the identity of touts advertising tickets. The Competition and Markets Authority applied for an interim enforcement order in the High Court. That means Viagogo will have to change its business practices until the end of a forthcoming legal battle. There were late-night talks, apparently, and Viagogo agreed to make the changes on a permanent basis. So this is going to mean changes to the way Viagogo operates. This enforcement order is going to mean it will have to publish more information to consumers, including the identity of whoever is selling tickets and whether they're trading as a business rather than a fan who bought the tickets and can no longer attend the show. And a trader is defined apparently as someone who sells more than 100 tickets a year. Now, a new study of graduate salaries suggests that women who don't go to university fall behind on wages much more dramatically than men who don't do a degree. The Institute for Fiscal Studies looked at graduate pay and found that by the age of 29, women with a degree earn more than women who haven't been to university. For men, the difference is 8%. The fact is said to be one factor is said to be women's low wages and part-time work when they haven't graduated. The study found that the type of university and subject also have a significant influence on salary. Well, we can speak to Jane Rowley, who's the Chief Executive of the Higher Education Careers Service Unit. She joins us live from Manchester.
Hello, Joanna.
We spoke to you earlier, but we got cut off because we had to go to a live event, but we're back again. So let's pick up with what we were talking about earlier. This is basically giving more of a picture around the different salary comparisons based on whether you've got a degree or you haven't, and whether you're male or female.
Yes, it does, and obviously it's talking in percentage terms. What it doesn't reflect is, in terms of actual salaries, you know, women's salaries are still behind men in different areas. But it is interesting to note that at that particular point at 29, women seem to get a boost, women graduates seem to get a boost early on in their career compared to men with non-graduates.
Are women earning more than men at that point?
No, they're not earning more than men, but they are earning more than non-graduate women. Men will still be earning more. It doesn't actually give us the salaries, it just gives us a percentage gaps. And there's less of a gap for male non-graduates than male graduates than there is between female graduates and female non-graduates. So although it looks like women getting a big boost, saying it's 28% higher than non-graduates, in terms of actual salaries it still won't be as high as men.
And of course there are the debts that you accumulate when you go to university that need to be factored into the picture as well.
Yes, and once people reach a particular income level, then they will be paying extra tax for the next 30 years. And that's just reflected in tax office. So it's not related to how high their salaries go. It just means that once they reach a certain threshold, they'll be paying extra tax. But over the course of a lifetime, if you look at a 45-year career, not just that snapshot after 7-8 years after graduating, people will generally, over the course of their working lifetime as graduates, earn a lot more than non-graduates.
I mean, there's a lot of data in this study. Other figures that come out are that the graduates least likely to be high earners are actually men who've studied an arts degree at a modern university. And when you look at women taking medicine can earn 75% more than female non-graduates. And just on the figure about the men with the arts degrees, men taking an arts degree are likely to have earnings of 14% below male non-graduates. When people go to university, is the amount of money that they're going to earn a factor?
It really isn't for the majority of graduates. It's all about their career aspirations. Some of it's connected to where they want to live in the UK, where they want to work. Obviously, there are different salaries. Not everyone wants to go to London and be a management consultant. So salary isn't really a big factor for people in their career choices. It's more about the satisfaction they'll gain from that career. So somebody going to do an arts degree, for example, won't be expecting to earn high salaries in the marketplace as, say, someone who's gone and done a banking degree or finance, expecting to work in the city. So although it paints a picture of where people will end up with salary, it really isn't a very big factor in graduates' decision-making process.
Why has this study had an age cut-off of 29? I mean, as you say, obviously life changes dramatically for a lot of people after that point, because that's when kids start to come along, if that's the route you're going to go down.
I'm not sure why they've particularly that point at 29 years old. I mean, what we do find with women in the workplace, women graduates in the workplace, they'll tend to work longer hours, or they'll be in careers where they'll actually get a relative higher salary at an earlier stage in that career. With men, once you hit over 30, the higher income premiums seem to hit in